of Political Science from Stellenbosch University, that's Professor Amanda Gouws. Good afternoon, Prof, and thank you for your time on the SABC News Desk.
Good afternoon, Kirshni.
These terror attacks, Prof, they do seem to be hitting France harder and faster than other countries, especially in Europe. Why has France become such a hotbed for terrorism?
Well, I think we have to take into consideration the fact that France has a rather large Muslim population, which is directly related to France's colonial policies, especially in North Africa. So you have Muslims that have migrated from former French colonies, and they feel quite excluded. France had a colonial policy of assimilation, so the people in the colonies actually became French citizens. But France is a secular state, so they feel quite excluded in the secular state. They feel marginalized, and there's a large population that's really unemployed, can't find work, don't assimilate into the culture, and they've become very radicalized, and some of them have joined terrorist organizations, have left France, joined terrorist organizations, and that radicalization is now coming back home to roost in the city center of Paris.
Yes, Professor, and we actually saw sections of of French society that you're referring to, the poor and the unemployed, rise up in disgruntlement. This would have been about 10 years ago, complaining about their marginalization and exclusion from wider French society. To what extent do you think these attacks will act as a catalyst for heightened divisions even?
Yes, because France is a multicultural society. So after that uprising 10 years ago, what the government actually did was to say, we are a secular state. We, for example, banning the headscarf in public places. We're banning the wearing of the burqa and so on. So it's also, people feel that is not necessarily religious symbols, but it's their cultural symbols. So they saw that as an attack on their culture. And what is happening now also with the large in-migration of Muslims from the Middle East and North Africa is that citizens feel very vulnerable, and this is being used by right-wing parties as a backlash against multiculturalism to say, well, look at this, the more we absorb people from the Muslim religion and culture, the worse things are going to get. So you have actually now heightened divisions by France citizens who are saying, well, multiculturalism isn't working. We don't want the people coming from other countries into France, and that being used by political parties on the right to foment the hostility and disgruntlement. So I think these attacks are actually going to aggravate that.
Prof, you've actually preempted what I wanted to ask next. We are trying to get a sense of the French political landscape right now. Who are the big players and what kind of political impact this will have? We're less than a month away before regional elections, and then we have the Le Pen National Front Party, which is trying to make further inroads at the ballot. Will these attacks actually add fuel to the rise of the far right in France and throughout Europe even? We saw that after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the party really throwing some spin on things as it tried to show incompatibility, if you will, between Islam and the values of the French people.
Yes, well, the party in power is the Socialist Party of President Hollande. And then there's the central party, the Democratic Movement, and on the right you have Jean-Marie Le Pen of the right-wing party. And there are other parties, but these are sort of the main players. And President Hollande's support and also his ratings have dwindled. His approval ratings in the last couple of months have really decreased. People are unhappy, and so there's been a few by-elections that his party has actually lost. So there's quite a close contention now for this upcoming elections, and I think that the governing party is very worried, and territory is gained by the right-wing party, either Jean-Marie Le Pen's party, who actually uses these attacks, but also the whole issue of in-migration of Muslim people to actually gain support among citizens. And I think the democracies in Europe is very vulnerable at this moment because they have open borders. Democracies work when people vote and agree on issues. And what we see now is that unless you have surveillance and unless you have very strict security measures, you cannot prevent these types of attacks. So necessarily what's already happening is that these attacks are now being securitized. It's being, the notion of a war on France. Those slogans are used. It's a war on France. And it is going directly against this idea of a melting pot and the creation of a multicultural society.
Professor, the question on everybody's minds right now, of course, is whether President Hollande himself will alter his policy on Syria because he is really feeling the pressure now. The French stance or position has always been for President Bashar al-Assad to step down. But then perhaps the French leadership will want to show that this kind of terror will not force them to change policy. How do you think the French will maneuver here, and how possible is it that they will scale down attacks against ISIL?
No, I don't think so. They've already said they're going to retaliate. And, it's not only their policies. They were not so involved in supplying legal force, but a part of these attacks is in retaliation for the United States drone attacks. So even no matter what France do, they can't prevent what their allies are doing. So France will continue with their alliances with Britain and the United States. And I think where we will see a difference is about the open borders. Now the question will be, what do we do with all these people coming from Syria? Because how do we know whether they're not actually ISIS sleepers, that they are actually being trained and they're coming into the countries, Germany and France and England. So you are going to see a clampdown on that. And you're going to see greater surveillance. But I don't think the policies against or in Syria will change. It will be now a more united alliance from Western countries trying to deal with ISIS in Syria.
Professor, very quickly before I let you go, we saw such strong European solidarity after the previous attack on Charlie Hebdo that was about 10 months ago. It triggered 3.7 million people marching across Europe. And we're seeing that's a kind of same solidarity now. But in Africa, at home here, we have scores killed every week in acts of terror. Why this glaring absence or lack of global and regional solidarity when it comes to the African continent? It does seem there is a perception that black African lives are less valuable than European ones.
Well, we should also ask that question, for example, about Beirut. Just a couple of days ago, Beirut actually had a worse terrorist attack. More people died than in France now, but we heard very little of that. So what I think here is also we need to ask who control the media. If we look who's in Paris now, the reporters, CNN, Sky News, BBC, they don't come to Africa when things happen in Africa. They don't think of Africa as democratic societies. They think of them as war zones and having conflict, and so what does a little bit more conflict matter? And I think that those are all perceptions based on how Africa is perceived as a failed continent, as failed states, and not necessarily newsworthy. If you have conflict all the time, it's not newsworthy. But Africa itself will have to do something about its security issues. About Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, the Maghreb Muslims who are actually very radical and have their links with Al-Qaeda. And we've seen now what's happened in the plane that was shot down over Egypt. So it becomes a place where these terrorists can get training and can set up bases. And that's very problematic for the rest of Africa, but also for Europe. So, the AU summit that was last year on terror was the beginning, and it said there needs to be a subcommittee on counter-terrorism, and I think that's very important. But I think the other important thing is that we need to look at the military-industrial complex. We have millions of light arms and small weapons on the continent. Last year, the United States offloaded $8 million worth of weapons in Africa. So it becomes a place where you can easily obtain weapons. And we will have to make policies on how weapons are regulated. And the military-industrial complex in Europe and America is central to this. So, they complain about terrorism, but at the same time they fuel terrorism. And I think that's a huge issue.
Professor Amanda Gouws from Stellenbosch University, thank you for sharing your insights with us on the PM News Desk. Moving on to other news.